What if some of the most iconic faces from Hollywood's golden age were quietly living outside the gender lines the world never saw? What if tuxedos, silk gowns, and cigarette holders weren't just fashion, but coded statements of identity? Behind the studio-controlled smiles were actors, singers, and performers who dared to exist between categories, some in secret, some in plain sight. In this documentary, we uncover the forgotten stories of 23 trans and gender non-conforming legends who challenged the rules long before the world was ready. Alla Nazimova. Alla Nazimova was a groundbreaking silent film star and theater legend, often remembered for her avant-garde style in defiance of gender norms. Born in Russia and rising to fame in the U.S., she became a force on both the Broadway stage and early Hollywood screens. But Nazimova's life off stage has long intrigued historians. She coined the term sewing circle as a discreet nod to a network of lesbian and bisexual women in the film industry, including herself. While not identified as transgender in modern terms, her masculine energy, rejection of domestic norms, and romantic relationships with women positioned her as a gender non-conforming figure. She often played roles with androgynous themes and lived her life far outside traditional female archetypes. Her mansion, the Garden of Allah, became a legendary safe haven for queer creatives. In a time when openly defying gender expectations could mean exile from the industry, Nazimova navigated fame with coded expression and strategic alliances. Today, many interpret her as a queer icon who subtly challenged binary gender norms. Though she died in relative obscurity in 1945, Nazimova's legacy lives on as a symbol of early defiance against Hollywood's rigid gender structures. April Ashley. April Ashley's journey to public attention marked a turning point in how Britain, and much of the world, viewed gender. Born in 1935 in Liverpool, Ashley served in the Merchant Navy before undergoing gender confirmation surgery in Casablanca in 1960, becoming one of the first British trans women to do so. Upon her return to London, she became a model, actress, and darling of the bohemian elite, even appearing in Vogue. But her rise came with a cost. In 1961, a tabloid outed her as trans, and her career was instantly derailed. The outing also led to a legal battle over her annulled marriage, setting a precedent for how trans people were treated under British law for decades. Despite the backlash, April lived openly and remained active in LGBTQ+ advocacy. She eventually received national honors for her contributions to equality. While her fame came after the traditional golden age, her story reflects the lives of many gender non-conforming people of that earlier era, who hid, were erased, or were forced to conform. Ashley's life became a bridge between the shadows of silent queerness in golden age culture and the loud, proud demands for visibility that followed. Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck remains one of Hollywood's most celebrated leading ladies, known for her strength, independence, and no-nonsense screen presence. Off-screen, she cultivated a similarly private but powerful persona. Throughout her career, whispers followed her, speculation about her sexuality, her masculinity, and her intense privacy. While there is no conclusive evidence that Stanwyck identified as trans or non-binary, modern queer and trans readings of her life and roles are not uncommon. She often portrayed characters who challenged traditional femininity, tough dames, self-made women, and morally complex figures, and avoided marriage and motherhood narratives that were expected of women in the public eye. Her closest emotional bonds were with women, and some biographers suggest that she navigated her career carefully to hide parts of herself from public scrutiny. Stanwyck never addressed the rumors, and the studios helped protect her image. Today, she serves as a lens through which we examine how Golden Age Hollywood forced many people into secrecy. While she may not fit into contemporary transgender identity, Stanwyck symbolizes the kind of public life shaped by intense image control, gender policing, and quiet resistance. An icon of ambiguous strength in a rigidly gendered industry. Barbett, born Vanderclyde Broadway in Texas in 1899, blurred the lines between gender and performance long before drag entered the cultural lexicon. A high-wire artist turned Parisian cabaret star, Barbett captivated European audiences with his gender illusion acts, gracefully performing as a woman, only to dramatically reveal himself as male at the end of each show. What made Barbett more than a novelty act was the artistry, elegance, and athleticism he brought to his performance. Jean Cocteau once called him an angel, a flower, a bird. Barbett trained rigorously and lived much of his life in gender ambiguity. Though he did not publicly identify as transgender, his fluidity has earned him recognition today as a gender non-conforming trailblazer. After a stage injury forced retirement from performing, Barbett became a consultant for Hollywood films, coaching stars like Gene Tierney in femininity and movement. His private life remains enigmatic, and the language of his time made self-expression nearly impossible. But Barbett's life invites reflection on how early 20th century entertainers challenged gender roles in ways that resonate deeply today. He was not just a performer in drag, he was a master illusionist who treated gender as a canvas. Billy Tipton. Billy Tipton was a jazz musician who lived and performed as a man for decades, with his trans identity only revealed after his death in 1989. Born Dorothy Lucille Tipton in 1914, Billy began presenting as male in the 1930s to pursue a music career in male-dominated jazz circles. He performed in clubs across the American West, recorded albums, and led bands. But it wasn't just for show. Tipton lived as a man full-time, had long-term romantic relationships with women, and raised adopted children as their father. He kept his medical history hidden from nearly everyone, and even close partners believed he had old injuries that explained certain physical traits. When he died of untreated ulcers, EMTs discovered the truth, shocking family and the public. The media coverage at the time sensationalized his life, framing it as a case of deception. Today, Tipton is remembered in trans history as a poignant example of how survival in gender-restrictive societies often meant living in secrecy. He wasn't simply playing a role for the stage. He created a life that matched who he knew himself to be, even if the world didn't have language for it yet. Christine Jorgensen. Christine Jorgensen became a household name in the 1950s, not because of her talents as an actress or performer, but because she was one of the first Americans to publicly undergo gender confirmation surgery. Born George Jorgensen Jr. in the Bronx in 1926, she traveled to Denmark in 1951 to begin her medical transition. When news of her surgery hit American headlines, it sparked both fascination and controversy. Instead of retreating from public life, Jorgensen embraced her new role as a spokesperson and entertainer, appearing in nightclubs and giving interviews that challenged misconceptions about trans people. Her poise and articulate advocacy helped introduce the subject of gender identity to mainstream audiences, decades before such conversations became common. While she faced invasive questions and public ridicule, Jorgensen also became an icon of resilience. She never portrayed herself as a victim and rejected the idea that her transition was shameful. Though she never found the Hollywood stardom she briefly pursued, Christine's impact on public consciousness far outlived her time in the spotlight. She opened the door, however painfully, for future generations of trans individuals to live more openly. Her courage at a time of cultural silence made her one of the true pioneers of transgender visibility. Coxinel, born in 1931 as Jacques Dufresnoy in Paris, became one of France's most celebrated entertainers, and the first French person widely known to have undergone gender confirmation surgery. She transitioned in the early 1950s and quickly became a sensation at the famed nightclub Le Carrousel de Paris. With her platinum hair, striking beauty, and stage charisma, Coxinel captivated audiences across Europe, eventually landing roles in films and headlining tours around the world. But her impact went far beyond entertainment. She became a trailblazer for trans rights in France and a symbol of glamorous defiance in the face of gender norms. Her fame forced a largely conservative society to reckon with the existence of trans people, even as laws and attitudes lagged far behind. Coxinel also advocated for legal recognition of gender changes, contributing to reforms that would benefit others long after her time. In 1987, she married in a Catholic church, an event that was unprecedented for a trans woman in France. Through her artistry, activism, and openness, Coxinel helped move the conversation about gender from backrooms to center stage. She remains a beloved figure in trans history and a reminder of the power of visibility. Danny Laroo. Danny Laroo was a flamboyant entertainer who found immense success in post-war Britain, though his career was deeply rooted in the performance traditions of the Golden Age. Born in Ireland and raised in London, he served in the Royal Navy during World War II and later turned to theater. His fame skyrocketed in the 1960s and 70s as a drag performer, known for elaborate gowns, soaring vocals, and a comedic flair that endeared him to audiences of all backgrounds. While Laroo identified as a gay man rather than a trans woman, his work pushed the boundaries of gender performance at a time when cross-dressing could still result in criminal charges. He once owned his own nightclub, starred in West End shows, and even headlined Las Vegas, a rare achievement for any British entertainer, let alone one in drag. Laroo's gender presentation was extravagant but polished, often closer to old-school Hollywood starlets than risque parody. Though he didn't identify as transgender, his life and legacy opened public consciousness to gender fluidity and performance long before such ideas entered everyday conversation. Danny Laroo remains a key figure in the lineage of performers who helped make space for broader expressions of identity. Elena Dehidalgo. Elena Dehidalgo is primarily remembered today as the vocal coach of opera legend Maria Callas, but her own life deserves a deeper look. Born in Spain in 1891, Hidalgo became a coloratura soprano of international renown in the early 20th century. While there is no definitive evidence that she identified as trans or gender nonconforming, there has been enduring speculation among some researchers and opera historians about the depth of her masculine traits, strong will, and rejection of societal expectations placed on women of her era. As a teacher, she held command in a highly patriarchal environment and was said to have an almost androgynous command of space teaching, not just voice, but presence, attitude, and power. Her influence on Maria Callas wasn't just technical, but psychological. Some suggest that Hidalgo taught Callas how to adopt a commanding stage persona, rooted in a defiance of gendered performance norms. Whether these readings reflect Hidalgo's own identity or simply her method, they underscore how her legacy goes beyond opera. She embodied a complex balance of grace and author that transcended expectations of femininity. In that sense, she occupies a place in the broader conversation around early figures who quietly resisted gender norms in performance and life. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer was one of the most enigmatic actresses of the 1930s and 40s, an embodiment of Hollywood's capacity to chew up nonconformists and spit them out. Her public story focused on rebellion. She refused to play the industry game, challenged authority, and paid dearly for it. Her private life, however, has invited layers of interpretation, including modern readings about gender identity. Farmer often rejected traditional femininity, both in her appearance and attitudes. She wore trousers when it was taboo, shunned makeup, and mocked the idea of being molded into a Hollywood doll. Her rage against the system landed her in psychiatric institutions, where she underwent a brutal series of treatments, including electroshock therapy and rumored lobotomization. Claims later challenged but never fully dispelled. While she did not identify as trans, Farmer's life reflects the way gender nonconformity, particularly in women, was pathologized. Her defiance of the feminine ideal that Hollywood demanded and her refusal to submit quietly made her a target. In modern times, she's seen by some scholars and activists as a tragic symbol of what happens to those who step too far outside gender norms in repressive systems. Her story is cautionary, courageous, and heartbreaking. Glattis Bentley. Glattis Bentley was a powerhouse blues singer, pianist, and gender-defiant performer who electrified Harlem's nightlife during the Harlem Renaissance. Dressed in tuxedos and top hats, Bentley sang raunchy, improvised lyrics in smoky clubs, openly flirted with women, and played the piano with bold confidence. Born in 1907 in Philadelphia, she rejected the roles traditionally assigned to Black women in early 20th century America and carved out an identity that was unapologetically queer and masculine. Her performances at venues like the Clam House and the Ubangi Club made her a star in the 1920s and 30s. But her boldness had limits in a society unprepared to accept it. As the post-war era ushered in conservative values, Bentley faced increasing pressure. In a 1952 Ebony article, she claimed to have cured herself through hormone treatments and married a man, though many suspect this was coerced or staged. Today, Bentley is celebrated as a pioneering, gender non-conforming figure whose lifestyle and artistic expression challenge modern notions of trans identity. While she did not identify as transgender by today's standards, her masculinity and defiance of gender expectations offer a vivid example of how queerness and gender variance thrived, even if briefly, in corners of the golden age before being forced underground. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo was the ultimate enigma of old Hollywood, a woman who mesmerized the world with her beauty and talent, yet retreated from fame at the height of her power. Born in Sweden in 1905, Garbo's cinematic presence exuded a cool, ambiguous allure that captivated both men and women. Her deep voice, stoic gaze, and androgynous elegance made her an unconventional star in an era when femininity was often soft and decorative. She never married and was rarely seen in romantic company. Instead, rumors of intimate relationships with women, including playwright Mercedes d'Acosta, followed her for decades. Garbo's private letters and lifestyle choices suggest a deep discomfort with being boxed into heteronormative or gendered expectations. While she never publicly identified as queer or gender nonconforming, modern scholars and LGBTQ+ historians often read her aloofness and detachment from traditional femininity as symbolic resistance. Her decision to retire in her 30s and live in solitude was also an act of autonomy rarely afforded to women in Hollywood. Garbo's mystique, rooted in ambiguity, continues to spark fascination. She may not fit cleanly into modern identity labels, but her life reflects the constraints and quiet rebellions of a golden age figure who simply refused to conform. Jackie Shane. Jackie Shane was a black transgender soul singer whose voice soared through the 1960s Canadian R&B scene, but whose identity remained a mystery to most audiences at the time. Born in 1940 in Nashville, Tennessee, Shane left the American South as a young adult to escape the deeply entrenched racism and homophobia of the era. She found refuge in Toronto, where she became the lead vocalist of Frank Motley and the Motley Crue. Shane captivated audiences with her emotive delivery and dazzling stage presence, performing hits like Any Other Way, which took on a layered meaning as she sang about embracing one's true self. Though she lived publicly as a woman during her performances, she never labeled herself in interviews, perhaps to protect herself in a time when being openly trans was dangerous. It wasn't until decades later that Shane spoke openly about her identity, confirming what many already believed, that she was a proud transgender woman who had simply chosen survival over self-exposure. Her 2017 reissue of Past Recordings earned her a Grammy nomination just before her death in 2019. Though she came slightly after Hollywood's golden age, Shane's career was shaped by the same forces of secrecy, resistance, and brilliance. Jane County is a punk rock icon, a trailblazer who exploded onto the scene in the 1960s and helped lay the foundation for gender fluidity in performance art. Born Wayne Rogers in Georgia in 1947, she began performing in drag in New York's underground scene, including Andy Warhol's Playhouse of the Ridiculous and Jackie Curtis's shows. County later fronted punk bands like Wayne County and the Electric Chairs, using her music as a platform to confront gender norms and attack hypocrisy. Her lyrics were raw, unapologetic, and often hilarious, and her presence on stage was a rebellion in motion, part glam, part rage, all attitude. County began identifying as a woman in the early 1970s, long before the term transgender was widely understood or accepted. Though she didn't conform to any one label early on, she lived authentically and loudly, pushing back against societal binaries through art and persona. She was among the first openly trans performers in rock music and used her career to challenge cultural assumptions about gender and sexuality. While she rose to prominence just after Hollywood's golden age, her work carried forward the legacy of gender-defiant performers from earlier eras, using a microphone instead of a movie camera. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford's legacy is one of brilliance and contradictions. On screen, she was a chameleon, tough, glamorous, and often playing women who refused to be dominated by men. Off-screen, her story is more complicated. While there is no direct evidence that Crawford identified as trans or non-binary, her gender presentation, career decisions, and emotional life have long inspired modern rereadings. Crawford cultivated a sharply angular look, wore pantsuits in private, and built her own empire, including real estate and business ventures. Some biographers have suggested her masculine energy, ambition, and rejection of traditional femininity made her difficult to market in a strictly gendered Hollywood system. Her sexuality, too, has been debated for decades. Several close female friendships, such as with Barbara Stanwick and Mercedes D'Acosta, have fueled speculation, though Crawford publicly denied any romantic associations with women. What makes her relevant in conversations about gender nonconformity is not proof, but possibility. Crawford pushed against boundaries imposed on actresses, redefined female power in Hollywood, and lived with an intensity that defied labels. Whether or not she identified outside of the gender binary, her persona embodied the refusal to be confined, which places her in the broader history of gender-defiant Golden Age icons. Julian Eling. Julian Eling was one of the highest-paid and most revered vaudeville performers of the early 20th century, renowned for his dazzling impersonations of women. Born in 1881, Eling mastered the art of female illusion so completely that he not only headlined major shows, but also starred in silent films and had a Broadway theater named after him. Audiences were mesmerized by his grace, fashion, and poise, many reportedly forgetting they were watching a man at all. Offstage, however, Eling aggressively projected hypermasculinity, often posing with cigars and women in photo ops. This overcompensation was likely a necessary defense against the suspicion and hostility that feminine men, or gender nonconformers, faced in a rigidly moralistic society. While Eling never identified as trans and may have viewed his performance as theatrical rather than personal, modern interpretations of his life raise deeper questions. Was his stage persona merely entertainment, or was it a protected space to express an identity he couldn't openly live? His career faded as vaudeville declined, and the post-World War I culture became less tolerant of gender-bending humor. Today, Eling is remembered as more than a performer. He's a symbol of the way early entertainers navigated gender expression in eras that left no room for honesty. He paved the way for others, whether he intended to or not. Louise Brooks. Louise Brooks was a silent film star whose bobbed hair and cool detachment came to define an entire era of American cinema. But behind her image as the original flapper was a woman who defied expectations at every turn. Born in 1906, Brooks became known not only for her beauty, but for her rebellion against Hollywood's control. She refused to play the studio game, walked away from contracts, and openly criticized the industry's misogyny. Her sexuality was fluid. She had relationships with both men and women, and her autobiography speaks frankly about her disdain for labels and conventions. Brooks often presented herself in a style that blurred gender lines, favoring clean, structured clothing and a sharp, androgynous appearance that became her trademark. While she didn't identify as trans or non-binary, Brooks's embrace of masculine energy, rejection of domesticity, and critique of female objectification place her within the legacy of gender nonconforming women in early Hollywood. She lived much of her later life in obscurity, writing essays and reflecting on the industry that once shunned her. Today, she's celebrated not only for her performances, but for her refusal to be anything other than herself, an artist who didn't bend to gender or cinematic expectations. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich remains one of the most enduring images of gender rebellion in 20th century cinema. With her deep voice, tailored suits, and commanding aura, she was both an icon of feminine beauty and a pioneer of gender nonconformity. Born in Germany in 1901, Dietrich rose to international fame with The Blue Angel and quickly became a star in Hollywood. She often appeared in men's clothing both on and off screen, smoking cigars, sporting tuxedos, and flirting with women in ways that were shocking for the time. Dietrich was one of the few celebrities who could cross gender lines with elegance and still maintain broad appeal. Her romantic relationships with women were an open secret in Hollywood's inner circles, and her private life has since been examined through queer and trans lenses. Dietrich never publicly defined her identity, preferring mystery, but her refusal to perform a traditional version of womanhood made her a symbol of defiance. She famously said, "I am at heart a gentleman." Whether she was performing masculinity or living it, Dietrich's life and style influenced countless gender nonconforming people for generations. She wasn't just a film star, she was a walking revolution against binary expectations. Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha P. Johnson is often remembered for her role in the Stonewall Uprising of 1969, but her activism, artistry, and gender-defiant life began far earlier. Born in 1945 in New Jersey, she moved to New York City as a teenager and quickly became a central figure in the city's drag and queer communities. Identifying herself as a transvestite or a queen in her lifetime, a term now often replaced with transgender, Marsha challenged every expectation society had of race, gender, and class. She was poor, black, mentally ill at times, and yet vibrantly defiant. She co-founded STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, with Sylvia Rivera, advocating for homeless trans youth long before the term trans rights entered the national conversation. Though her most visible work came after Hollywood's golden age, Marsha was a spiritual successor to earlier gender nonconforming performers and activists who couldn't live publicly. Her joyful resilience, flower crowns, and ever-present smile made her a beloved figure in life and a martyr in death. In 1992, she was found dead under mysterious circumstances, long ruled a suicide but later investigated as a possible murder. Marsha's legacy continues to shape how we talk about gender, visibility, and resistance. Ramon Navaro. Ramon Navaro was one of the silent film era's most celebrated heartthrobs, known for his exotic charm and roles in epics like Ben-Hur. Born in Mexico in 1899, Navaro was groomed by MGM to be a Latin lover successor to Rudolph Valentino. But behind the studio-constructed image was a deeply private man struggling with the immense pressure to hide his homosexuality. Navaro was gay in a time when even whispers of queerness could destroy a career. He had discreet relationships with men, lived in fear of exposure, and reportedly battled religious guilt instilled by his Catholic upbringing. Some modern interpretations of his life frame him as a queer icon forced into a tragic double life. He was never publicly gender nonconforming, but his experience speaks to the broader reality of gender and sexual expression being violently repressed in Hollywood's golden age. Navaro's death in 1968 was particularly brutal. He was murdered by two men who targeted him for being gay, a crime that shocked the entertainment world and was sensationalized in the media. His story is often used to illustrate how deeply the industry suppressed not just trans identity, but any form of queerness that didn't fit its mold. Roberta Cowell. Roberta Cowell holds a remarkable place in British history as the first known British trans woman to undergo gender confirmation surgery. Born in 1918, Cowell's early life followed a traditionally masculine path. She was a decorated World War II fighter pilot, a race car driver, and a mechanical engineer. But behind this facade was a deeply personal struggle with identity. After the war, Cowell began to explore gender reassignment, undergoing hormone therapy and eventually surgery in the early 1950s, facilitated by pioneering physician Dr. Michael Dillon, who himself would later be recognized as the first trans man to undergo phalloplasty. Cowell's transition was groundbreaking in its medical and social implications. Her 1954 autobiography revealed her journey in her own words, making her one of the first trans people to publicly share their experience. Despite her courage, she became increasingly reclusive in later years, distancing herself from the growing LGBTQ+ rights movement. She feared how the media had twisted her story and felt alienated by evolving conversations around gender. When she died in 2011, it was discovered that she had been living in near anonymity. Roberta Cowell's legacy is complex but vital. She represents both the daring of early gender pioneers and the loneliness imposed by society's refusal to understand them. Sir Lady Java. Sir Lady Java was a trailblazing performer in 1960s Los Angeles who made headlines not just for her dazzling stage presence, but for her bold challenge to unjust laws. A black trans woman and nightclub entertainer, she captivated audiences with her impersonations, singing and comedy acts at prominent venues like Red Fox's Club. But in 1967, her career came under threat when the LAPD invoked Rule Number 9, a city ordinance that prohibited impersonation by means of costume or dress. Java, who performed in glamorous women's attire, was effectively banned from doing what she loved. Rather than retreat, she fought back. With support from the ACLU, she challenged the law in court. Although the case was dismissed on a technicality, it sparked public conversation and eventually led to the rule being struck down. Java became a local icon of resilience and visibility, advocating for trans rights before the language or framework existed. Her fight is often overshadowed in broader LGBTQ+ histories, but her courage paved the way for future performers and activists. Sir Lady Java didn't just perform on stage, she performed resistance at a time when being herself was an act of defiance. Her legacy continues to inspire trans women of color in entertainment and beyond. Stormé de Larverie. Stormé de Larverie was a singer, drag king, and gay rights activist whose legacy is interwoven with the birth of the modern LGBTQ movement. Born in 1920 to a black mother and a white father in New Orleans, Stormé grew up in the Jim Crow South and later found refuge in performance. She became the MC of the Jewel Box Revue, the first racially integrated drag show in the U.S., and was often the only masculine-presenting woman in the lineup. With tailored suits, a confident stride, and a striking voice, Stormé blurred gender lines at every turn. But she wasn't just an entertainer. She was a protector. As a self-appointed guardian of New York's queer community, she patrolled the streets to keep gay youth safe, especially trans women and lesbians who were frequently targeted. Many credit her as the woman who threw the first punch at the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, though her exact role remains debated. What is certain is that Stormé lived with courage, refusing to be boxed in by race, gender, or sexuality. She identified as a butch lesbian, but exhibited many traits associated with gender nonconforming or trans-masculine identity. Stormé's story is one of defiant visibility and lifelong activism, a pioneer whose presence demanded respect in every room she entered.